Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on provider regulation, accountability, driving performance. My name is Janet Anderson. I am the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commissioner, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting right the way around Australia, and paying my respects to elders past and present, and extending that acknowledgement of respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us for today's webinar. Now, alongside me for today's session, I have two guests, as it were, Peter Edwards, who is the Executive Director in the Commission for Compliance Management, and also Raelene Thompson, who is the Board Chair of Uniting Agewell. Before we get into discussion, I'll do a quick bit of housekeeping. You can ask questions at any time. Just use the question box via the live Q&A tab, which should be visible on your screen. We do have a short survey for you to complete at the end of today's webinar. So if you stay online, the survey will actually pop up onto the screen. And we do encourage people to complete it and submit it, because we get a lot from it. You can give us your feedback on today's session, but also on matters that you would like to hear from us about in future webinars. We are recording today's webinar and we will be publishing it on our website in the next couple of days. And everyone who's registered for today will get a link sent to you for the recording if you want to watch it again, or recommend it to your colleagues. Now, let's get started. As I said, the subject for today's webinar is provider regulation, accountability, driving performance. And the key topics we're going to cover are the ones listed here on this slide: the importance of strong provider governance, how we are rebalancing our regulatory approach to focus more on providers and services, how we regulate at the approved provider level, and what that looks like in practice. We want to use this webinar to talk about how we have started to change some elements of how we regulate and why that is key to our mutual success. Now, I use the words mutual success because all of us ultimately want the same thing, whatever role we have in the sector. We all want older people to have a great experience of aged care, one where their individual rights and preferences are respected, the care they receive is high quality, and there are fit for purpose safeguards built into the system to protect them from foreseeable harm. And achieving these outcomes for older people relies in large part on you, if you are a provider, you understanding and actively working to comply with all your obligations, not just the quality standards. So the Commission's role here is to incentivize that sort of provider behaviour, not just compliance, but continuous improvement. In fact, when you think about it, our effectiveness and efficiency as the national regulator relies on us creating the circumstances where it is logical and appealing and as straightforward as possible for the provider to do the right thing, not just occasionally, but every time, and particularly when we're not looking. That requires us to understand how providers are making decisions and choices about how their services are operating. And here's where we're shifting our focus. When we become concerned about a rising level of risk of harm in one or more services that a provider is operating, we are now much more focused on assessing the suitability of a provider's operating model and the governance capability to detect and contain the risk. So in short, what we're more interested about now is to understand whether the provider is aware of the risks and what they're doing about them. Now, this very much aligns with the intent of the governance reforms that we introduced at the end of 2022, of which you would be very aware, and with the provider registration model that will be introduced under the new Aged Care Act. So this shift to provider level regulation recognises that the long-term change needed to lift performance across the sector is best achieved when those in senior leadership roles in providers, so I'm talking about CEOs, governing body members and chairs, when they understand and fulfil the full scope of their responsibilities and accountabilities. So it makes sense, therefore, for us to concentrate on engaging at that level, at the provider level, more often than we have historically, rather than with individual services, particularly where we see older people experiencing preventable harm or there is a pattern of non-compliance. So this adjustment in our focus, or the rebalancing of our level of engagement, is more of a shift for residential service providers than it is for home services, where we have for a longer period been regulating more at the provider than the service level. But just before I hand over to Peter, I want to reflect on one of the observations that was made by the Royal Commission, which I think highlights a key theme that runs through today's webinar as we think about what the senior provider leadership and governing bodies need to have front and centre in their minds. Now, Commissioner Pagoni in the Royal Commission said, deficiencies in the governance and leadership of some approved providers have resulted in shortfalls in the quality and safety of care. Some boards and governing bodies lack professional knowledge about the delivery of aged care, including clinical expertise. Here is the important sentence. There is a risk that governing bodies may focus on financial risks and performance without a commensurate focus on quality and safety of care. Now, that last sentence is bolded because, frankly, it reinforces our own observations about what is sometimes a two-tier approach among providers about how they view their responsibilities around the management of risk and performance. And let me illustrate this in the following way. When we engage with the provider about their financial or prudential compliance issues, they rarely, if ever, suggest that we work with their service, even though the risks of not complying with those obligations manifest at the service level. In contrast, when there's a serious quality or safety issue, it's not uncommon for a provider to take for granted that we will be working through those issues with the service. So herein is an illustration of the problem that the Royal Commissioner was calling out, that some providers and governance bodies are failing to put into place a balanced set of systems and processes and controls that demonstrate they understand they are accountable for managing all risk, not just financial risk, but all risks. This responsibility and the accompanying accountability must be owned by the very top of the organisation. And what we find is that when providers compartmentalise risks and parcel them out to different parts of the organisation, or even worse, outsource them or try to outsource them to the Commission, what happens is they tend to lack an integrated strategy supported by appropriate reporting that helps them to detect and respond to the full range of risks they need to manage. And it's this integrated view of risk that matters, because managing risk in isolation from each other and at different levels in an organisation will ultimately distort the things that a board or a CEO is paying attention to and prioritising in their decision-making. Now, at the Commission, we understand this integrated view of risk, as this slide indicates, and it's why we analyse provider-level risk through multiple lenses. And that includes analysing the financial data, workforce data, serious incident notifications, complaints data, in addition to gathering all that intelligence through service-level monitoring activities. Now, if we, the Commission, are looking at you, the provider, in this way, you should be doing the same thing, particularly given that most of the data that we have available to us is data that you have reported to us. Okay, now I'm going to hand over to Peter, who's going to expand on this theme. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks, Janet, for your excellent introduction, and thanks to all of you who have taken time out of your busy schedules to join us online. I've got a bit to go through, so I'll try to make it as painless as possible because I'm very keen to get to the conversation at the end of this presentation. I'm really pleased to have an opportunity to talk on this topic because I think it is such an important one, and I think together, if we get this right, it will really help us to shift the sector in the direction that it needs to shift in. So before I get into the specifics, I'll touch on something else that the Royal Commission said that further reinforces why the various reforms being implemented move us into this direction of a much greater focus on making sure that provider level leadership and governing bodies recognise the very, very important role they play in shaping behaviour at the point of care. Commissioner Pagoni went on to say that accountability begins and ends with the leaders of an organisation, the board and senior management. If boards and governing bodies do not have the knowledge or skills to understand the care that is being delivered, they are unable to ensure that this care is high quality and safe. The values and behaviour of people in these senior positions have a significant impact on workforce culture and the quality of care delivered. When these values and behaviours are poor, so may be the care that people receive. I think we all know that through our own experiences over the course of our careers. How staff know and understand what leadership values is through the things that they're required to report on and what the organisation invests its time and financial resources on. Rarely is the quality of leadership and governance judged purely by what people in those positions say, unless what they say does not align with what the leadership measures and invests in. Therefore, good leadership and governance is underpinned by a well-balanced set of systems, practices and controls organised in a way that promotes a positive workforce culture, a culture in which people delivering care will be rewarded for doing the things that matter most to people receiving care, complemented by an investment in those staff to continuously improve their ability to care for people well. And that investment includes building the capability and confidence of all staff to identify and report when things have gone wrong or are about to go wrong, so they can either be fixed or ideally a poor outcome can be prevented. Now, I want to emphasise that we understand that no system of care is perfect. However, what we know is the best systems of care are those that are good at identifying when things are not working as they should. And I'll expand on that theme shortly, because it's really at the heart of what good provider level risk management looks like. But before I do that, I really do want to acknowledge that we know at the Commission that delivering aged care is complex. Therefore, it can be hard to establish a well-balanced set of controls and systems supported by fit-for-purpose reporting. And it's in recognition of that challenge that we have structured our regulatory strategy around what we call the supervision approach. Now, I won't go into detail about that now, as that's something for a future webinar, other than to say that when we see compliance risk, our goal is to engage with the provider to make sure that they are doing everything necessary to fix it. If the risks are high, we will case manage the provider until we are satisfied that the causes of non-compliance have been addressed. That won't necessarily involve us using our formal regulatory powers unless we see evidence of reluctant or resistant behaviour or promises not kept. We take this approach as we understand that when things go wrong and the risks are high, it is not necessarily because a provider is willfully disregarding their obligations. Therefore, we will usually want to give providers an opportunity to put their best foot forward, as that is much more efficient for everyone involved. But most importantly, it offers a more robust and sustainable safeguard for older people. But as Janet outlined, our preferred point of engagement is changing. And we are now routinely working directly with key personnel at the approved provider level, rather than one of their services. And there are some really important reasons for this. An important reason is that approved providers carry the legal responsibility for assuring the performance of their services. It is also the case that when we see risk or harm at the service level, it is often a symptom of a broader provider level problem. Let me explain the reasons we see that. I mentioned that we understand that no system is perfect or infallible. Therefore, at any given time, there will always be a level of non-compliance somewhere across the sector. Our reasonable expectation is that providers will have suitable mechanisms in place to identify that non-compliance for themselves before we do. For that reason, we get concerned when we confirm that there is risk at a service that we identified through our own risk detection methods, or worse, where we uncover harm being experienced by older people when we visit that service. Our level of alarm increases further when we advise a provider's leadership group about the serious harm that is occurring, and they complain that service level staff have let them down, or worse still, brush it off as an isolated incident. The latter situation is of particular concern to us for an important reason. A provider who dismisses an instance of serious harm is a provider who probably won't learn from it. And that's a recipe for ongoing problems in their services. What we want to see are providers who understand that by identifying and analysing the causes of discrete issues and outlier issues, they are actually testing the effectiveness of their systems, practices and controls for detecting and managing risk. In short, we expect to see providers taking responsibility and being accountable for protecting and safeguarding older people in their care. This is the key reason we are giving increasing attention to provider level leaders of services where we are seeing higher levels of risk or where risk has already led to harm. We have found that when we do that, and the provider level leaders engage with us in good faith, or if they don't, and we need to give them a bit of a nudge through use of our powers, it leads to better outcomes for those receiving care. Provider level engagement is more likely to support sustainable change in behaviour at the service level because it's the provider is the one that has implemented the controls. This results in the provider maintaining a sense of ownership over the change and ensuring that suitable ongoing monitoring of those controls is in place. In contrast, the outcomes we achieve through service level engagement tend to be much patchier. Even though the systems of controls the service may implement might be exactly the same. And the reason for this, and I think this is a very important insight, is that when we, the Commission, engage with the service rather than the provider, we become the de facto accountability mechanism that is often missing at the provider level. This not only puts us in a position of having to take on provider responsibilities, which is not ours to own, but it also means that as we gradually reduce our level of supervision, there is often a commensurate reduction in compliance with the new practices, particularly as staffing at the service changes. If improvements in a service's performance are short-lived because they are not being overseen appropriately by the provider, then that's clearly a problem for everyone. It's for these reasons that the government decided to introduce the requirement about governing body composition alongside the existing Quality Standard 8. So now, most approved providers must have a governing body with a majority of independent non-executive members, supported by a basic committee structure that can feed those board members the information they need to manage their accountabilities and hold senior leaders accountable for implementing the decisions that the board makes. Now, I know through various conversations that I've had with people across the sector that some consider these obligations to be a burden that possibly makes it more difficult to attract board members. We do understand the challenges that some providers face in this area, but the Royal Commission was clear about the benefits of getting the right people to sit on governing bodies. Also, the new membership requirements will become even more important as we move towards a provider registration model under the new Act. What we know is that strong governance is a prerequisite to strong performance. And we see this all the time. The governance and leadership of a provider makes a huge difference to the way the organisation is run and the outcomes it achieves for and with older people. Ensuring that older people are well cared for is something that matters to everyone. Doing that well and safely requires people who have the commitment, skills and curiosity to deliver on that assignment. What the Royal Commission made clear is that there is no place for those in positions of responsibility to be passive bystanders. On the contrary, they must be alert, engaged and ambitious for their services to excel. And isn't that the aged care sector we all want to be a part of? That's why we will work with providers who are willing to work with us to meet their governance obligations and all their other obligations that they have. The starting point is an expectation that providers will comply with their legal obligations. Having said that, we are realistic in understanding that it's very difficult for every provider to sustain full compliance all the time. So where a provider is non-compliant, whether you volunteer that information or we discover it through our own detection methods, we approach this in a considered way. What we want to understand are the risks arising the risks for older people that are arising due to the non-compliance are being mitigated, and that as a result, people are being kept safe and their care is of a high quality. And we will ascertain that through our engagement with you. In every instance, we look for a commitment by a provider to travel along the path towards compliance in a timely manner. Because if you're not interested in doing that, you are failing to hold yourselves accountable for the very, very important work that you do. And then this leaves us needing to hold you to account by compelling you to act, drawing on our regulatory powers. As I said, it's always our preference that when we detect risk of harm, to work with providers to confirm that you're putting in place controls that will contain or eliminate risk to older people. If there is good evidence of that, we are far less likely to use our formal powers to compel action because that simply would not be necessary. However, that doesn't mean that we are reluctant to use our powers. Rather, it means that we make careful decisions about when that is warranted. When we become aware of significant harm has occurred, I just want to make you aware that we are likely to follow two paths concurrently. The first path is the one I've already discussed. We will engage with you, we will work with you to make sure that safeguards are being put in place to prevent the problem that has caused the harm happening again. And if there's willing participation by you as a provider in that process, we will monitor your actions to ensure that the necessary changes are implemented. The second parallel path involves us examining the circumstances that led to that serious event and harm occurring. Predictably, in relation to this second path, we will be most concerned if we find that the serious event was foreseeable and that the provider had made little, if any, effort to contain the risks that eventually led to harm. Even worse is a situation where we find evidence of a passive disregard by the provider for their responsibilities to people they are caring for. Where we find that is the case, we will be assessing whether that failure warrants enforcement action by us. That's because unacceptable failures in care leading to serious harm to older people must have serious regulatory consequences. Fundamentally, these events reflect a provider's failure to exercise effective governance and oversight of their services. And our role in the Commission includes ensuring that the leadership group of every provider takes their governance responsibilities seriously. Now, I appreciate that this is probably a rather somber note on which to end my bit of the webinar, but I want to close by emphasising that providers exercising strong, effective governance who are able to demonstrate that they are making best efforts to detect and manage risk are far less likely to find themselves the subject of regulatory enforcement action. That's because those providers are demonstrating through their actions that they understand the importance of the job they are doing and are giving it the attention it deserves. And I think all of us would want to be receiving care from a service that is overseen by people with that level of commitment. Thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to coming back for questions a bit later in the webinar. And back to you, Janet.
Well done, Peter. You've conveyed a lot of information very succinctly, and looking forward to the question and answer session. And just reminding those watching that you do have the opportunity of submitting questions, so please do, and we'll get to as many of them as we have time to. Now, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage, as it were, Raelene Thompson, who is board chair of Uniting Agewell. So, Raelene, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in today's webinar. Would you mind starting by giving us a brief description of your organisation, please?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Janet, and thanks for the opportunity to participate too. I really appreciate it. So our organisation operates in Victoria and Tasmania. It's a company owned by the Uniting Church in Victoria, Tasmania, and we have 19 residential homes with about 1,500 residents. We have approximately 3,500 home care residents and over 13,000 CHSP participants, as well as some retirement living as well. That's in a nutshell.
Okay, that's a fairly substantial enterprise. And as board chair, how long have you had that role?
So I've been the board chair for 6.5 years, and we have a 3-by-3 year term, so I'm in my last term.
You would have seen an enormous amount of change over that period, and I'm quite sure that you and your colleagues who may have served for that length of time would have a lot to talk about. So let's come to the content for this webinar. What I'm interested in exploring with you are your thoughts on the information that Peter has shared with us, and particularly what he was conveying by way of the Commission's increased focus on regulating at the provider level. Does that make sense to you? And feel free to speak candidly, as I know you will.
Yeah. Thanks, Janet. Yes, actually, it's a topic of conversation our board has entered into over the last year or so, I suppose, as we've come out of the COVID and pandemic issues and what they brought to the surface, I suppose. And we are of the view that provider-led accountability, I suppose, is the way to go. So we welcome this approach. Is really fundamentally what I'd say.
Oh, that's good. Okay. Well, perhaps unsurprising. I mean, I know we did talk beforehand, but it's good to hear you say it with degree of enthusiasm.
Yeah.
As both Peter and I have said, we acknowledge that delivering aged care is complex. It's any sort of social care setting comes with inherent risks. You can't eradicate all risks and pretend that it's going to go well all the while. But I'm interested to hear your perspective on what you think are the key challenges for our board and possibly your board in getting information you need to develop a well-rounded view of competing risks that need to be managed at different levels of your organisation.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think it is fundamentally, whether you're a large provider of many services or you're a standalone residential care provider, the issue is the same. How you work out what's important for you as a board in terms of the governance of your organisation is really the key. And we always start with the challenge of, well, what does our organisation stand for? What are we actually doing as an organisation? If you can define that, then you can start to look at what information you are required to get to answer those questions. Are you delivering on your vision and your service offering? Are you picking up risks across a whole framework? And we call it our clinical governance framework. So it talks about leadership in that framework. It talks about clinical risk, talks about organisational risk, but really it sums up all of the things that you want to be looking at to make sure you can sleep at night, really, is the way I describe it. You know, all these things you do as a governing body is about risk and opportunity, and you've got to balance those two things. So when we get information coming in, we try to understand what it means both for risk and for compliance, but also for that ambition we have as an organisation. So we try to weigh those things up. And in a big organisation, there's a lot of information coming in, and you can get caught up in just receiving information rather than thinking about why you've asked for that information in the first place. We find it very useful to have frameworks around clinical governance, risk, you know, financial management, whatever it may be. But it just gives you some clear sight within how you've defined the framework that works for your organisation. And then you can drill down when you need to assure yourself around some of these, you know, information things that are coming in, and what does it mean for you in terms of the line of sight you want to the care and services that you deliver. So
I'm going to break into the flow here because Andrew has put forward a really interesting question, and I without notice, you might do a top of the head response on this. It goes as follows. As a director, I often get reports from management which say we have met all relevant clinical KPIs and have no complaints. How do I know this is not because of a failure of the reporting system to identify risks? It's asking about the integrity of the data gathering and analysis and reporting arrangements that apply. Is that something that you and your board have thought about?
Yeah, it is. And it's a really important question, isn't it? Because data is just data put in front of you. What does it mean to you? And one of the things that we talk about, and this is where the expertise of your governance team comes in, I think. So the immediate question to me, if I got someone telling me there were no complaints, I would say, well, that's not good, because in any system, some sort of feedback will come in, and I would want to know both, you know, the compliments and the complaints. So that would be a red flag for our board if someone said to us, no complaints. One of our board members used to say a complaint is a gift, and people would sort of, you know, go, oh, really? But what her point was that it's an opportunity to analyse what has gone wrong or look for, you know, a continuous improvement opportunity there. So, yeah, I think you've got to ask the question when you get presented a sort of blank report, which sounds like what that was from Andrew.
Yeah, okay, all right. So on the same theme, just extending it a bit further, there's an old saying that what you measure is what you manage. So what I'm looking for from you is an illustration or some reflection on whether you've seen the power of reporting shape positive changes in behaviour, either among your board colleagues or through the leadership group or further into your organisation.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Yeah, so I agree. If you don't measure, you won't know what's going on. But I think we're very good at measuring numbers and things like that. We all understand that in the financial space, we can do that, and to some extent, we do it with our clinical framework as well. But an example I could give you is when we were measuring wound management or wound issues, even before the reporting framework that came in. And we started to see a pattern across our services, small numbers, nothing that you would look at a service level and worry about. But when you added it across a number of sites, we were able to say, this is something that is a flag for us and we need to investigate further. And so that led to a serious review of our wound management practices and led to changes in products being used and processes in place. And that's a quick example of measuring was not just for a compliance, it was for a real understanding of we want our residents to not have any wounds, any skin integrity issues, but we know that we have to measure that and we have to then do something with it. You don't just measure it for the sake of it. You know, whether you're applying that to your financial management or your occupancy reports or whatever they may be, if you don't know why you're collecting that data and measuring that information, then you shouldn't be doing it, actually. That's what I would say. It's got to inform you. And the role of the board, I think, is to constantly ask themselves, is this informing us as to how our organisation is operating?
I love also your illustration about the virtue of curiosity. We see this in this service. What do we see? What is equivalent in other services? Oh, that's interesting. Let's look at that more closely. That fundamental aspect of asking the next question: where is this going to take us? What should we be concerned about? What we're seeing, or reassured? If we're concerned, then there's a further line of inquiry here that we need to work on with the senior team. And that's it's a lovely way of demonstrating that point. Thank you. So, thinking about the culture in your organisation and generalising, how important do you think the board is in building a culture across an organisation of open reporting, especially when things go wrong? And obviously, I'm contrasting that with a blame culture where staff can become very risk averse and decide to conceal rather than disclose a near miss or an error because they're concerned about the consequence for them. And so you're not getting the learning happening. But as a board, what role do you play in cultivating the right culture across the organisation?
Yeah, look, I think it's the most important thing for a board to do, and that is to establish what are the values of your organisation. And we pay a lot of attention to that, and we try to in recent times, we've reassessed our values within our strategic plan, and we've got 5 values, but the 2 that I constantly refer to are kindness and respect. And so that goes to the culture of your organisation. And some people may criticise the word kindness. It's an old-fashioned word, but we actually feel very committed to that as a mark of our organisation. So then when you talk about your values, you can start to talk about the fact that your organisation wants to get better, wants to improve. And so as a board, everything we do, we try to reinforce that culture of kindness and respect, which respect to your staff as not just your clients and your customers and your residents, but to everyone. And so when we put a policy out that might talk about risk management or whistleblowing or whatever it might be, that allows you to establish an open reporting framework, it's got to reflect that fundamental, what is the value of your what are the values of your organisation. So we do a lot of talking to our senior staff about our expectations around that, and with the expectation that will flow through the organisation. We're a big organisation now. We've got a lot of staff, so we can't speak to everyone individually, but we can put expectations on the senior executive as to what we expect to flow through the organisation. And of course, we also try to spend a lot of time out and about with our service areas, interacting and reinforcing those messages. It's a constant thing that you want to do. It's not just the responsibility of the executive team. The board needs to be present. They need to be open. We have events that reinforce that sort of behaviour as well. But it is tricky. Like, I'm not trying to say there's a quick way to do that. It's a constant journey, I think, for an organisation to continue to reinforce the culture that you're looking for.
One of the risks of being a board member or a board chair, and particularly in the larger organisations, is the increasing distance from those receiving services. The older person who has a right to expect that they will be kept safe and they receive high quality care. How do you lead your board in ensuring that you hear with clarity, in an unfiltered way, the consumer's voice in all of this? Because that's hard. They're not attending board meetings in the main, and they are out there receiving care where the board is not often. So how do you overcome that?
Yeah, it's very challenging, and as we grow bigger, it becomes more and more an issue. So particularly in our home care space, I'd say residential is a little bit easier because you can go and visit and you can interact with the residents and their families closely. So that's part of what we do. But we also have systems in place to gather feedback directly. We have a report every month to our board on complaints and compliments, but also we seek a case study every month that allows us to reflect on what has happened to a person, and sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're not. And they're both valuable, of course, because they give us an understanding of a real live case. We, of course, receive reports on serious incidents and root cause analysis of those incidents, but we also seek direct feedback from family and residents who are able to, and use all of those avenues. But I do think it's still the most challenging aspect of running an aged care service, because many of our residents don't have strong advocates with them, or they're not able to speak for themselves. So we're using the systems that we have in place, and we're continually updating them to gather information. But ultimately, I think we have to get out there and talk to our staff, talk to the people who provide care into our services. That's another lens on what's happening. And
sorry.
Yeah.
The new governance obligation in relation to offering your older people the opportunity of establishing a consumer advisory body is clearly in the mix here as well. And
Yes.
I expect your leadership team is probably progressing that work, because that's certainly an expectation that is now prevalent across the sector.
Yes.
Final question. Thank you. Final question, and then I will open the floor to all of those watching. Continue to send your questions in, please, and we will take as many of them as we can in the time we have. Raelene, boards don't always get things right. I'm not suggesting that yours routinely gets things wrong, because I suspect that's entirely not the case with strong leadership. But where a decision doesn't go to plan, what is your response to that? How do you lead your board through that, so that you extract something from the the departure from goal, in order that you can become a better board? You started this conversation talking about continuous improvement, and I wonder how you apply that to your own role and the leadership that you offer to your board.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Yes, so very important to not rest on your laurels, I think, is probably the summation of that issue. Yeah, so we've had occasions where we've made a strategic decision that hasn't turned out exactly as we hoped, and sometimes that's one in particular I'm thinking of probably impacted on our financial bottom line to some extent, unexpectedly, I would say. So you can start looking for whose fault it is, or you can actually look at what does it mean for you as a governing body. And we certainly reflect. We reflect every month on how we're conducting our meetings and our committees, and is it meeting our needs as a board. But when something major happens and the direction that now we're going in has deviated from the plan, so to speak, we do take stock of that and think through what was it in the business case where we didn't ask the right questions? Was it in the context, the environment that's changed, whatever it might be, and how could we anticipate that for future decision making? So over time, we've refined our business case model to make sure that it's as accurate as possible and has a good risk assessment, or whatever it may be. But I think the key is to constantly reflect in your decision making. Was it aligned with your business plan? Did it deliver what you expect? And if not, what can you do next time based on the information that is in that real live case? You don't have to look at people to blame. It really is part of that continuous improvement model.
It's very strong leadership. Congratulations. And thank you for reflecting so carefully and in such a considered way on what is an ongoing challenging job, but one clearly that you've that you're determined to do as well as possible. So congratulations on that. All right. We now come to the question and answer session, and the questions are coming in, which is great. I'm going to start, Peter, with one for you, and it's about home services. And the question is, how will the new regulatory strategy impact the regulatory oversight of providers who provide home services? Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, no, I'm very happy to answer that. Before I do, just a mea culpa. If you heard some dinging during my presentation, it was me, because I hadn't closed all my applications. And so we operate now in this multi-channel world where you're never left alone for more than half an hour. So apologies if the dinging was distracting. I've now fixed that problem up. It's good for me to practice. Just an example of open disclosure. There you go. So look, I think for home care providers, this change is going to be less pronounced, because we've always been working at the provider level, just partly due to the nature of the services that are delivered, as Raelene touched on. It's really out of necessity we need to be working at the provider level, and out of necessity providers are needing to put in really good systems of control, because they don't have, because the clientele is spread across a geographical area. So it is less pronounced. Obviously, there's a lot of reform in this space around support at home, and we expect that will be moving fast over the next couple of years. But the way we've built our regulatory model is really to future-proof that. So we don't think that for home care providers it will be as significant as for residential providers. But I do think that there'll also be a level of cross-pollinisation, because there are many home care providers that are also residential providers. And so when we look at an issue, we'll also be looking at that issue and what it says about what might be happening on the home care side of the equation, as well as the residential side. And I think, and that's really to assist providers to see how those controls are working in a way across all of the different types and different services that they're delivering.
Thank you. Now, I have a question from Chris, which I'm going to put to each of you in turn. And it's well worth taking this one on and clarifying our position. So it goes like this. Contemporary best practice corporate governance states that boards cannot be expected to get too involved in operations. They delegate certain levels of management decision-making and govern rather than do.
Yep.
Otherwise, you risk getting too deep into management issues, and I fear that the Commission might be pushing boards to get too operational. Interested in the Commission's response to this. Peter first, and then Raelene, I'm interested in your perspective as well, because I did not pick up a sense from you that you were intruding in the legitimate role of your senior executive, but you were exercising oversight, which is exactly what the Commission is expecting. But Peter, do you want to just offer a couple of sentences on that?
No, I'm really, really grateful that someone's put that question forward, because that's certainly not what we are seeking to do through this. What we want is for boards to be suitably curious across the full range of risks that they're managing. Now, how they go about doing that, we don't expect them to get involved in the operational detail. In fact, as your question suggests, I think that may very well then render a board ineffective, because it's then getting into the role of managing things. But what we do want to see is providers having those systems that actually assist them to understand what's happening at an appropriate level, so they can make good decisions. And sometimes that might be just having appropriate exception reporting, so that when something passes a certain threshold, the board gets interested, but below that threshold, it doesn't need to be interested in what's happening at a particular service.
Yes, and Janet, what Peter just said, the last thing about exception reporting, I think really is your key. It is tricky, I have to say, with the level of compliance and regulation, not just from the Commission, but from all the sorts of regulatory frameworks that an organisation now finds itself in, to not get down into the weeds sometimes. But we as a board actively try not to do that. You know, if we do that, we certainly pull each other up and say, hang on, that's not our role. So I think it really does come to an expertise and experience of board members to ensure they do understand governance versus management. I know a lot of people come from management into governance, as did I, and you really have to hold yourself to you have to be disciplined, I think, in how you approach the information that's put before you and what your role is. Somebody once said to me that governance and management is a wriggly line. It's not a hierarchy, it's not a pyramid, it's not a straight line. It's a bit of a wriggly line. And sometimes that's what I try to keep in my head, that mostly you don't drill down, but every now and then maybe you will. And when you do, you know why you're doing it. And often it's around a risk issue, I think. But in general, you have your clearly defined roles and you understand that as a governance body, you're there to set direction, to have accountability overall, to take responsibility for the difficult decisions, and to allow the expertise of your executive team to operate in the management of the organisation. So that's how we approach it.
What a good answer. Thank you, Raelene. All right. We've got a bit of a run of questions. Peter, I'll send this one in your direction. The tenor of the questions is there any extra money coming our way to assist us in exercising this level of governance and accountability? Do you want to take that one on?
Look, thanks, Jan. Look, and that's not an uncommon question, and a question that I field, you know, through my day-to-day work, and my answer to that is always the same, which is, in the absence of good governance and leadership, if you do have constraints around money and resourcing, then you're going to find it even harder to manage the risks. So it's as harsh as it sounds, it's not a nice to have that you sort of tack on to the edge of to the side of the organisation. It's actually the primary mechanism through which you manage risks. So and the expectation has always been, as Janet and myself have said, that the accountabilities rest with the approved providers, you know, the leadership and the governing body. So it's really about making sure that you're set up for success, because all of those money issues are going to be much harder to manage if you don't have you know, appropriate governance. But having said that, it's a bit of a plug, a shameless plug, Janet. There is some excellent resources in the governing reform, and which is available on our website, because and I was a bit of a latecomer to some of that, and I must say that you know, the quality of the information and the podcast is excellent. And I'm a member of the Institute of Company Directors, and I say it's up there with a lot of what they are doing. And so I would suggest that if you are struggling and you're looking for sort of opportunities to educate governing persons to, you know, around accountabilities, and also how to think about oversight of aged care, there are some very excellent resources available through the governing reform program.
Thank you, and thank you for the plug too. Well done. Raelene, next question for you, and it's about the conversation you and I had in relation to the older person's voice. And Nikki has said that her consumer advisory bodies provide a lot of feedback that is largely operational, such as there should be water bottles in residence rooms and so on. And this is normal feedback that belongs in her continuous improvement feedback system. So her question is, how do we focus them on the bigger picture? Do you have a perspective on that? Sometimes the smaller picture is exemplifies a larger domain for action. But what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, look, I think it's tricky. Before the changes that now require us to put our consumer group together happened, we had something similar in place in our organisation, and we actually wound it up a couple of years ago because it was not meeting the need that we thought, which was to bring it up to a more, systems level. So we recognise the problem that's been identified in this. So this time round, when we're establishing the new body, we've taken the opportunity to think through, firstly, how you select the people who come onto the committee, and how you induct them. And I think this is our attempt to get this right. So I don't know if it'll work for everyone, but already in our process, one of our people who was very enthusiastic to come has decided he doesn't want to do that anymore, because he really was more about just his individual service and what he was looking for there. So it's very tricky to do, I think, but you just have to keep trying, and you have to do it with the knowledge that you don't want to just set up a duplicate board with people who are used to, thinking at the whole of organisation level and that. So establishing a group of people who will have individual concerns, but can also relate those to broader issues for your organisation, is the type of individual that you're looking for to participate on this. And I think it'll take a bit of trial and error to get there in our organisation and in any organisation. But that's how we're approaching it, the selection and induction process as a starting point.
And always with a view, presumably, that to not filter out inconvenient voices, because sometimes the inconvenient voice is the golden one, where if you ignore it, then something becomes a much bigger problem in the future. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay. And if I could just include that, very purposefully, we're looking for difference and diversity in the voices that are coming in. But once they come to us, we're trying to make sure they're fully informed about the broader role they can have in the organisation, so they see it as an opportunity for participation.
Okay. I think this might be our final question, and thank you for everyone who has submitted questions, because you're really paying attention, and you've clearly thought this through when you've encountered your own challenges and looking for some tips and tricks, which hopefully we've provided you. Peter, very briefly, and I'm going to constrain the way in which you're able to answer this by limiting your time. I'm sorry about that. I mentioned, and I think you also referred to, integrated risk management. Just in a couple of sentences, can you recap for us the essence of that? We practice it in our analysis and our response to risks, but what does that look like if you're in the provider's shoes? What are we actually talking about?
Well, it's understanding your financial situation, it's understanding your liquidity, which is really key to your ongoing viability. It's understanding what serious incidents are happening. It's understanding who's complaining to the Commission, because that's very important, because that demonstrates that, people who then subsequently complain to us, there's a level of leakage around that. So understanding why it couldn't be resolved, closer to the service. It's understanding the nature of those complaints. It's understanding through your own assurance mechanisms what you're finding through your own monitoring activities. It's marrying that up with what the Commission is finding through its monitoring activities. It's testing how far those are away from each other, but it's also then trying to triangulate all those sorts of things in order to understand whether it identifies emerging risks that you might need to manage. So really, as you said, Janet, at the outset, it's really what Commissioner Magoni was sort of calling out, is that it has to be more than just focusing on the money. It has to be thinking about the money alongside all of those other things that happen that impact care.
Thank you. Well done. Very succinct. And focused, which I think is a nice way to conclude the discussion we've been having. Thank you to Peter and Raelene for what I think has been a very content-rich webinar. And thank you also for all those who participated and watched on and contributed questions. Clearly, this is going to be part of an ongoing discussion. We'll continue to communicate with the sector over coming months, certainly in the lead up to the commencement of the new Act. It's in all our interest to ensure that accountability does drive performance. And I say that about the Commission, just as I say it about providers in the sector. And we are absolutely committed to supporting providers in the sector to perform at your best and to deliver positive outcomes for every single other person for whom you provide care. So thank you for your participation. There is a survey and we ask you to stay online to complete it. And as I said at the outset, and I think someone even asked, and I will reinforce that this webinar has been recorded and a copy of the recording will be available on our website, and we will send a link out to everyone who registered. So if you want to watch it again or send it along to a colleague, please feel free to do so. Until next time, thank you all for joining us today. Bye for now.